Alright, so I'm thinking we might take greed, come up this way. So is there another? In my first fight. I must be a piece of shit. Kushner? Where the another misplay. Why is he talking like that? Why the fuck is he talking like that? Kushner. I mean, this shit is obvious, but oh, wow. We gotta take the well-laid plans. There's no doubt about it. 18 damage. Yeah, the Houthis just randomly started attacking ships. I have to buy something. Man, what fucking common cards am I gonna have to take here? 8 of these. Alright, listen now, guys. Never happens. Hezbollah never attacks Israel because innocent Israelis. Fucking bullshit. I'm never gonna be able to easily put that into play, right? One, two. I only have 3 cards that draw cards. Whatever, I'm going to fight him with 12. Transform or upgrade? Shit, bro.
actually believe this? And the answer is hubris, okay? They do believe this because they have hubris. And again, it's hard because we're not in their position. But once you're in that position where you have access to nuclear weapons, when you can kill anyone in the world, when you can see everything in the world, it makes you think you're God. Okay? And we remember, like last semester, we were reading the Greeks. And the Greeks believe the worst thing is hubris. Because it makes you think you're God. But you're not God. And you're going to get into a lot of trouble if you think you're God. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Any more questions? It makes you think you're God. Okay? And we remember, like last semester, we were reading the Greeks. The Greeks believe the worst thing is hubris. Okay. So, because it makes you think you're God. Trump says that Iran is 1 month from developing a nuclear bomb, right? America's been saying this for the past 10 years. Okay? You just Google this, and America's like, oh, Iran is only 1 month away from a nuclear bomb. They've been saying this for the past 10 years. So, you understand? When Trump gives his speech, there's absolutely no evidence that any of this is true. Okay? But this is how he will explain the invasion. All right? And for no reason and get them trapped. Okay? So that's the question. And what I want to do now is make you the argument that there are two ways that we can prove or provide evidence this is true, okay? The first is historical analysis. Historical analysis means that are there historical examples like this? Okay? Are there historical analogs? If there are, then this could be true, okay? The second method is through game theory analysis. Why would the actors who are rational do something as stupid as trap 100,000 American soldiers in Iran? All right? So we'll first do historical analysis to find historical analog examples similar to this. And then we'll look at game theory to sort of reason out the motivation of the actor. So let's first look at game theory. Oh, sorry. Let's first look at historical analysis. Okay. So here is 450 BC, okay, in Athens. Remember that we studied Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, last semester, okay? So we will now discuss the Peloponnesian War. The war is the year is 415 BCE. And for the past 17 years, Athens have been fighting a brutal war against Sparta, okay? It's a stalemate. And then for whatever reason, a man named Alcibiades, okay, has a suggestion. And his suggestion is, to win the war against Sparta, let's go invade Sicily. And Nicias, his opponent, is like, why the hell would we want to invade Sicily? It's far away. And Alcibiades is like, well, because it has a lot of money. And if we invade the country, we can take their money. Okay? And it turned out, by making this argument, the people of Athens really support this argument, okay? Because the reason why is, war was costing them a lot of money. And they become addicted to the easy money of empire, okay? So they want to fight this war. So Nicias has this great idea of how to convince people not to go to war, okay? And what he says to the people is, okay, guys, I know you want to fight this war. I know that you think this war is a good idea, but Sicily is a huge place. It has a navy. Therefore, we need a massive expedition force against Syracuse and Sicily, okay? We need at least 5,000 soldiers. That's a lot, okay? Because the total Athenian population is about 50,000 people, okay? 5,000 soldiers is a lot for Athens. And we need about 100 ships. And the idea is Nicias is trying to scare people into not agreeing to not fight, okay? That's the idea. The Athenians say, that's a great idea.
That was an accident.
Let's send a massive force against Sicily and Syracuse so the war can be won just like that, okay? Shock and awe. So
Luckily,
the problem, though, is that never before in its history has Athens sent a
RNG
large
granted me
expedition force against
0 life loss.
another power. Okay, does that make sense? When the Persians invaded, they were invading Athens. Athens didn't go invade Persia. So when you have sent a massive expedition force against another country, what is your number one problem? What is the thing that you must
Logistics.
resolve? But the Athenians didn't really think about it because they had absolutely no experience in fighting a foreign war.
What is it? What's he gonna say?
Okay.
The answer is logistics.
So the enemy knows the terrain better than you do, okay? But there's actually a much bigger problem than that. And it is what? Okay, the biggest problem is resupply. And this is something that the Athenians didn't think about because they never thought, they never fought a war like this before, okay? So they sent this huge expedition against Sicily. And Syracuse, which was a naval power, were surprised because they were like, why would the Athenians want to invade us? Okay? So for the first year, the Athenians were destroying the Syracuse army. And the Syracuse army had to retreat back into their city, okay? And so the Athenians laid siege to the city. Okay, the Athenians, Syracuse is here, the Athenians are here. And the Athenians control the sea, right? Okay? So this situation is very similar to this situation, okay? Do you understand? But then what happened was that the Athenians couldn't resupply themselves. And the reason why is Syracuse also had a navy, and they could stop the Athenian navy from resupplying the Athenian troops. And therefore, the Athenian army was wiped out in Sicily. And this caused the Athenians to ultimately lose the war against Sparta, and it caused the Athenian Empire to collapse. Okay? Do you understand? And again, historians have been trying to figure out for a long time why the Athenians would do such a stupid thing as to send a huge army against Syracuse, because the risk of failure was catastrophic. Okay? And the only answer is, well, the Athenians had hubris, okay? They never really lost the war, and they had become addicted to empire, which is the same situation America finds itself in today. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? All right? So this has happened before in history, when the Athenians invaded Sicily and lost to Syracuse. Their entire army was wiped out in Syracuse, okay? Because they couldn't resupply their army. Does that make sense? Right. The second example we can look at is the Vietnam War. So in the beginning of 1960, okay, in the beginning of the decade, most Americans have never heard of a country called Vietnam. Okay? Most Americans didn't know what it was, didn't know where it was, okay? By the end of the decade, in 1969, 500,000 American soldiers were in the country, destroying everything, okay? But also getting destroyed themselves. 58,000 US soldiers died in Vietnam. So the question then is, how did this happen? Why would this happen? 1960, Vietnam was a distant country no one's ever heard of. By the end of the decade, 500,000 US soldiers were in country fighting this war against an enemy they really didn't know. Okay? In 1971, the Pentagon Papers came out. And the Pentagon Papers was a history of America's involvement in the Vietnam War dating back to the 1950s, okay? And it made 3 major points. The first point is that American leadership, military leadership, has been expanding the war in Vietnam without public knowledge, okay? This is what we call mission creep. So maybe at first they sent some observers to the country, then they sent some advisors, then trainers, then soldiers, okay? So mission creep. Slowly over time, things escalate. And you don't really understand why things escalate, but they do, okay? Second point is that American leadership, from very early on, knew the war was unwinnable. This was the greatest military in the world. They dropped more bombs in Vietnam in the 60s than all bombs were dropped in World War II, okay? And they could not win the war. And the reason why is, to win a war, you have to solve 3 problems, okay? Okay? The first problem is clear strategy, okay? What are you trying to accomplish in this country? What are your clear military objectives, okay? Second is, you must adapt to the battlefield, okay? Because all your best plans will change over the course of a battle, okay? So the adversary that is most willing to adapt to the battlefield will win, okay? The third thing is the will to fight. So if you want to look at a war and who's most likely to win the war, you ask these 3 questions. 1, does this guy have clear military objectives that everyone understands? Because that will determine strategy, okay? Second is this guy adapting to the battlefield? And the third is this guy, does this guy still have the will to fight? If the answer is yes to all 3 questions, then the person will most likely win the war. Okay, and if you look at the Vietnam War, even though America was killing a lot of people, it killed 3 million Vietnamese during the course of the war, it was not destroying the enemy's will to fight. In fact, it was making them angrier. And therefore, more people were willing to fight the Americans. Okay? So, very early on, the American political leadership knew the war could not be won. So then the question then is, why did America stay in the war? And the answer is credibility. Okay? Credibility just means they didn't want to lose face. They didn't want to be laughed at by the Chinese and by the Soviets and by the Europeans, okay? But there's actually another way to understand credibility, and it's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. Okay? Have you guys heard of a sunk cost fallacy? And the idea is never ever go into a casino. The reason why is that when you go into a casino and you start losing money, at some point you cannot leave the casino. Why not? Exactly. You want to reclaim the money you've lost, okay? You've invested so much that you cannot leave. You have to get that money back. And that's the problem with war. Eventually, you've invested so much, you cannot leave the war. And that's what happened in Vietnam. America invested so much, it didn't want to leave the war because it did not want to admit that all this has been lost. Okay, it's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. And that's why, even though America could not win the war, it still wanted to fight the war. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so the Vietnam War is another example, okay, that is similar to this, where America invests enough soldiers that it refuses to leave the war and admit defeat, okay? Does that make sense, guys? All right. Now let's look at one more example. And this is the most recent example, and it's the Russian-Ukraine war. Now, as you know, in February 2022, Putin ordered a special military operation against Ukraine. Okay? And this is Ukraine. And Russia attacked from three axes. Okay, the north to take Kiev, the capital. You have the east to take Donetsk. And then you have the south from Crimea to take the south, okay? And as we know, the north failed, okay? The north attack failed and the Russians had to turn back. But the east and the south were successful, okay? Now, let's think about this. You have an extremely powerful military attacking your country, the Ukraine. If you were the Ukrainian president, if you were the Ukrainian military, there's really only one way you can fight this war and win. And what is it? Using traditional military doctrine. How must you fight this war? You guys know? Let's go back to mass forces, avoid encirclement, protect supply lines. How must you fight this war? There's only one way you can fight this war. See me? How do you disrupt supply lines? There's only one way you can fight this war and win. And what is it? The enemy is attacking you, right? So what must you do? Okay, the answer is you must retreat. Okay? Why? The enemy is attacking, right? So you pull back your forces. Why would you do that? What's the logic of that? Exactly, okay? It's that simple, okay? You want to overextend your enemy. Ukraine is a huge country, right? And Russia didn't send out that many soldiers, maybe 160,000. That's not that many soldiers. So if you just give them space, they're going to outrun the supply lines, okay? And then when they outrun the supply lines, you can encircle them and you can disrupt their supply. And that's the only way you can win the war, okay? What did the Ukrainians do instead? That's the only way to win this war. But what did the Ukrainians do instead, which made them lose the war? Yeah, so the Ukrainians refused to give up space, okay? They refused to give up land. They want to fight the Russians for every inch of territory. And eventually, because the Russians had more forces, mass forces, they were able to push through, okay? So that's the first major mistake that Ukraine made. But then last summer, Ukraine launched something called a counteroffensive, right? So once Russia was able to take space, because Russia is a land army, it started to develop fortifications, defenses, okay? Mainly artillery. And that's 3 lines of defenses. And in the summer offensive, the Ukrainian military, for whatever reason, sent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers against this artillery, and the Russians blew everyone up, okay? Now, here's a question. Why are the Ukrainians doing this? They've lost the war now, right? They have no more soldiers. Right now, the average age of the Ukrainian army is it's over 40 years old. They have guys in their 60s and 70s fighting in the military. They don't have enough manpower. The war is lost. Why would the Ukrainians do this? First of all, why would they fight for every inch of territory? And why would they launch a counteroffensive against a superior enemy?
The war is lost.
What's the problem? Okay, the first is their president, Zelensky, the guy's a TV actor, okay? Which means that he doesn't think strategy, he just thinks what looks good on TV. So for the first 2 years of the war, we're watching this on TV, right? And it looked as though the Ukrainians were going to win this war, right? I remember like 2 years ago, people were saying that the Ukrainians are going to march to Moscow and overthrow Putin. People were saying that, okay? And the reason why is that Zelensky is a master of public image manipulation, okay? He was distorting reality for people through television. The problem with that, though, is it's not reality, guys, okay? Reality on the ground is very different from TV, okay? So who else is like Zelensky in this world? Trump is exactly like Zelensky, okay? Do you understand? Trump is also concerned about what looks good on TV. He's like, I must look strong. We must look as though we're winning this war. He doesn't really care about strategy, okay? So because of this, it's very likely that he orders a land invasion of Iran because it would look good on TV, okay? So the problem with Zelensky is he cared about what looked good as opposed to actually what actually worked, okay? But you also have other problems, like you have extremists in the Ukrainian military, okay? And guys, these
Why is he
extremists,
talking
they're
about that
Nazis,
in
they're
the
neo-Nazis.
past tense? This is
And
fucking
so the traditional understanding of Nazis are people who kill Jews, okay? But the Russians don't understand Nazis that way because remember, Germany and the Soviet Union fought this war. So the Russians understood Nazis to be enemies of Russia who want to kill Russians. And there were many neo-Nazis in Ukraine. They hate Russia. They want to kill as many Russians as possible. Okay? And they're the ones who are pushing for as much war as possible. Okay? So you have these extremists in the Ukrainian military. Okay? The last reason is NATO. So it's an open secret that NATO is helping the Ukrainian military against Russia. You have NATO military advisors devising strategy against Russia. Okay, so it's most likely that the summer offensive last summer was a NATO plan and not a Ukrainian plan. It's possible. We also know that NATO special forces are in the country directing missile strikes against Russian forces, okay? Which means what? If this is true, and if Ukraine loses the war, meaning that it doesn't have enough soldiers to continue to fight this war, what will NATO do? Yeah. I mean, according to what happened to Vietnam War and the Athenian expedition against Sicily, it is most likely that the most likely outcome will be that NATO sends its own troops against Russia. Okay, so Macron of France have said that we want to send French soldiers, and the British Prime Minister has said that he is considering conscription for British people. Okay, which means that young British citizens will be drafted into the army to fight Russia. All right, so these are three historical examples that are very similar to what could happen in Iran. Okay, does that make sense, guys? All right, any questions before I continue? All right, is this clear so far? All right, now let's use another mode of analysis called game theory analysis, okay? And this is what I've been teaching you this semester. And the idea is that society, what happens in the real world, is a game among human beings. Okay, and each person is trying to play this game as to optimize the outcome for that person. Okay, so the question then is, why would the United States send 100,000 troops into Iran? So let's look at the individual motivations of the individual players, okay? So you have the United States. What does the United States want to do? What does it want to do? By doing what? And accomplishing what? It wants to topple the regime in Tehran, right? And you can only do that through a ground invasion, okay? So the United States is trying to topple Iran. But then you also have other actors, okay? So Iran. What does Iran want to do? What does Iran want to do? Or basically the Revolutionary Guard Corps. What do they want to do? Right? They want to kill as many Americans as possible, okay? You understand? They want to force an American land invasion, okay? So Iran wants to force a US invasion, knowing that if the US invades, it has to lose the war, okay? It will lose the war because the Revolutionary Guard can just send suicide bombers against the United States, okay? Now let's look at Israel. Okay? We know that the United States wants to topple Iran. We know that Iran wants to force a US invasion to defeat the Americans,
It's not
to
just
humiliate the
suicide
Americans,
bombers, it's a fucking
and
modern military. Fucking war.
exact revenge for what happened in the past, okay? What does Israel want to do? What is Israel's optimal outcome? You guys know? If you're Israel, what do you want to happen? Okay, so you want Iran defeated, okay? And then what do you want to happen? You want Iran defeated, you want the proxies defeated, and then what do you want to happen? Do you want the United States to stay in the Middle East? What happens if the United States? What happens if the United States and Iran both lose the war? I mean, Iran is destroyed as a country. The United States is destroyed as a military presence in the Middle East. What would happen? Israel becomes the top dog in the Middle East. Do you understand? Okay? Israel can now control the entire Middle East. So the optimal outcome for Israel is Iran and the United States are both destroyed. Okay? You understand? How about Saudi Arabia? What is their optimal outcome? Exactly the same as Israel, exactly. Okay? You understand? Okay? Which will leave the Middle East to Saudi Arabia and Israel, but Israel is a far superior military than Saudi Arabia. Okay? Remember, it's very easy to blow up Saudi Arabia. They have oil fields, okay? Not that easy to blow up Israel. So Israel becomes a top dog. Do you understand game theory? In other words, all the major participants want an invasion of Iran. Okay? But they want different outcomes. And Saudi Arabia and Israel most benefit if this situation happens, where you have 100,000 US troops in the country and they can't get out, okay? Because it becomes sunk cost fallacy. The United States can only pour in more soldiers. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So is this clear to you guys? Okay? You can either use historical analysis to get to this outcome, but you can also use game theory to get to this outcome. Any questions so far? Okay, great, okay. So Celine asked the most pivotal question, okay? The United States has nuclear weapons, which is its ultimate trump card, right? So what Trump can say to Tehran is like, I have 100,000 troops in country. You have to let them go, or I will nuke you, okay? You understand? Trump can say that. Listen, I'm Trump. I'm Donald Trump. I need to look strong. I have 100,000 troops in the country. I can't get them out of the country. So he says to Tehran, you either let them go, okay? You either guarantee him safe passage out of the country, or I will nuke you. Right? So that's what will happen. That is what Donald Trump will do. Once the situation arises, the only way for Donald Trump to save face is to threaten Tehran and says, you either let my guys go, or I will nuke the entire country. Right? So, how does Tehran get out of this situation? How do the Iranians protect themselves against this possibility? Because you're absolutely right. This is exactly what will happen if this situation will arise. Trump will respond with nuclear weapons, with a threat of nuclear weapons. So what must the Iranians do to protect themselves against this possibility? Who can help the Iranians now?
Nobody.
Russia. Okay, do you understand? So before this war happens, Iran and Russia must come to an agreement where Putin says from the onset, no one is allowed to use nuclear weapons. Okay? If Iran uses nuclear weapons, I will nuke Iran. If the United States uses nuclear weapons, I will nuke the United States. If Israel uses nuclear weapons, I will nuke Israel. Okay? If Putin says that, how will the world react? If Putin says this, you are not allowed to use nuclear weapons, how will the world react? He's a hero, right? He saved humanity. But because he says this, the United States is now trapped. Okay? You understand? And so this becomes a black hole for the United States, where they can only send in more troops. They can't get any troops out. They can only send in more troops. What's the problem with this? What's the problem with sending in more troops? No, there's actually a huge problem with this idea of sending in more troops. What is it? Okay, you can't, like, no one wants to go fight, you understand? The military cannot recruit soldiers, all right? But even if you did have enough troops, as Jack says, you can't resupply them. Why? Why can't you actually resupply your army? Why not? But there's a bigger problem than the supply lines. What is it? What do you need to create bullets and ammunition? America has no manufacturing capacity because America moved all its manufacturing capacity to China. Okay? Remember this. So for every one ship that America can build, China can build 232 ships. That's what the Pentagon says. Okay, do you understand? So if this war were to happen, there's absolutely no way America can win this war. It's just completely trapped inside Iran. And once it becomes trapped, some cost fallacy comes into play, and America just puts in all its resources into the country, but it's a black hole, okay? It cannot use nuclear weapons because Putin has said from the onset, you are not allowed to use nuclear weapons, all right? But now the question then is, why would Putin do that, right? Why would Putin involve himself in this war? And that's what we'll discuss next class, all right? How Putin sees this war and how Putin will react in this war. Okay? But before we end, are there any questions about any of this? Does this make sense to you guys? Is this clear? Any questions? Oh, that's a great question, yeah. So the problem with Iraq is that Iraq is an independent country. You understand? There are 10,000 American soldiers in Iraq. So you would need their permission. Even if you had their permission, there's a problem here because there are lots of Shia militiamen in Iraq who are loyal to Iran. Okay? And they would see the American invasion force as an opportunity to attack the Americans, okay? Because they're still angry about the Americans for what happened in Iraq. But even if they could have a staging area in Iraq, they still have to deal with mountains. Okay, do you understand? All right? I mean, the problem is you have 100,000 troops in the country. You have to get out of the country, okay? And it's very hard to get them out of the country. If you go for the mountains, you're gonna get ambushed in the mountains. If you go for the air, those drones are gonna strike you down. That's the issue, okay? All right? Does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions? Okay, great. So on Friday we'll talk about Putin, okay? So this week, Vladimir Putin, in a speech, said to his Russian people that all of Russia must now prepare for total war. Even if you are not fighting on the front lines in Ukraine, pretend you are. And because of this speech, there are many analysts who believe that Putin is preparing Russia for total war. And total war means that every aspect of your society is geared towards winning a war. And so we last had total war in World War II, okay? But not after that. So why is Putin doing this? Now, there are some people who believe that it's because Russia is not doing so well in Ukraine. They lack manpower, and so they need to mobilize their society to fully win the war in Ukraine. Okay? Another explanation is that Putin knows that NATO is preparing to send reinforcements to Ukraine. Remember that because of last summer's offensive, Ukraine is desperately short of manpower. Okay? The average age of their soldiers right now is over 40. They have men in their 60s who are fighting in the front lines.
So this story.
Emmanuel Macron of France has publicly stated that he is considering sending French troops to Ukraine. The British themselves are thinking of conscription, drafting all young men into the army. The American politicians have said that they're considering a new law that would give citizenship to illegal immigrants who join the army. Okay? So it seems like NATO is only going to escalate the war in Ukraine. And so Russia is preparing for that. One more explanation, one more possibility is that Putin wants to expand the war. Okay? So he knows he's winning in Ukraine, and he's thinking about attacking Moldova and possibly the Baltic states. Okay? These are all possibilities. Today, this morning, what I want to do is argue another possibility, which is that Putin is mobilizing his society because he sees war as a tool, as a mechanism to radically reshape the people in Russia. Okay, so think of a metaphor. Okay, you're fat, and you're like, okay, how do I get fit? How do I get trim, right? You go to the gym and you work out. And for Putin, that's what war is. War is a workout for your society. When you enter war, you become a much more disciplined, unified, and prosperous society. Okay, so that's what I want to argue today. Okay, so why does Putin think like this? Well, let's look at the current state of Russia. Okay? Russia, in many aspects, is a broken society. Corruption. Russia is the most corrupt society in all of Europe. The rich people steal, and then they run off to Europe or the United States or Dubai. Okay, so corruption is a huge problem in Russia. And because of corruption, the GDP of Russia is very low. So South Korea, which has about a third of the population of Russia, has a higher GDP. Okay? The state of Texas, just one state in the United States, has a higher GDP than Russia. So Russia, in many respects, is a very poor country. Okay? Second problem is alcoholism. 1 out of every 6 Russian males, about 16, 17% of the population, they're alcoholics. Okay? It's a disease. They have the disease of alcoholism. 1 out of every 3 deaths in Russia is because of drinking too much. And because of alcoholism, the rate of young men dying is just increasing and increasing, okay? The third problem is fertility. So right now, the fertility rate in Russia is 1.5. That is below
Alcoholism isn't
the
the
replacement level,
cause
right?
of these
Remember that
things.
the
These
replacement
guys
level
fucking,
for society is 2.1.
sociologists.
Russia is 1.5. The problem is you have a lot of men dying because of alcoholism, okay? So since the year 2000, the population in Russia has been declining steadily. And all this means is that if current trends continue, then Russia will cease to exist as a society, okay? The nation will die. So why is this happening? Well, okay, the Western explanation is that this is happening because Russia is not democratic, right? If you had full democracy and you unleash the human potential of your people, then Russia will prosper. But Putin, Vladimir Putin, has a different explanation, okay? His explanation is that this is happening in Russia, okay? Corruption, alcoholism, and low fertility, because Russians have been lied to, deceived, and manipulated by Western civilization. Western civilization preaches the gospel of liberal democracy, of freedom, of human rights, of consumerism. And these are all lies. They're hypocrisies that have fooled the Russian people and have corrupted the Russian soul and destroyed Russian civilization. And because Russians are abandoning their soul, their civilization, their nation, this is why this is happening. Okay? Does that make sense? That is Putin's argument. So why does Putin believe this? Well, in the late 80s, the Soviet Union had basically lost the Cold War. And they lost the Cold War because their elite basically gave up. They no longer believed in communism. They didn't believe in self-sacrifice for the nation. They thought that Western values, the Western lifestyle was much better. Okay, so they gave up. In the late 80s, there was an American historian. He actually works for the American State Department. And his name is Francis Fukuyama. And he wrote an extremely influential essay called The End of History. End of history, okay? With a quotation mark. And he argued that the Soviet Union fell and America became triumphant because liberal democracy is the best idea to have ever been invented. And to make his argument, he uses the philosopher Friedrich Hegel, okay? Now, Friedrich Hegel had something called the theory of the dialectic. And what Hegel argued is that history is determined by a war of ideas. The progress of history is determined by the movement of ideas. And how ideas work is that they have a pattern called the dialectic, okay? So there's a thesis, a new idea comes into being. But then we recognize that this idea has problems. It's too extreme. It's too problematic. So we create an antithesis, okay? But this antithesis itself is also too extreme. And this creates also problems. So then what happens is the thesis and the antithesis come together and create a more moderate, more efficient idea, okay, called the synthesis. And this is how history moves or progresses. And so Fukuyama takes this idea and says, okay, well, this explains what's happening today, where at first you have a thesis called capitalism, okay? Capitalism. And this created the Industrial Revolution, right? And because capitalism was too extreme, we moved towards communism, okay? Communism was created to counteract the extremes of capitalism. But communism itself is too extreme, so then we move towards the middle, which is the right idea, which is called liberal democracy. Okay? So what is liberal democracy? Well, at the core of liberal democracy is the idea of consumerism. And the idea of consumerism is that we exist to buy things. And as long as we buy things, there'll be world peace. Why? Because consumers have a need to buy, and therefore nations have a need to produce. And nations produce the best when they're trading together as opposed to warring against each other. Okay? So this is the argument that Francis Fukuyama makes in the end of history. I want to explain this argument further, okay? What's he really saying? Okay, so throughout human history, all societies have struggled with one problem, which is how do we optimize the workforce? How do we get each and every person to work as hard as possible for our society? And if everyone did that, then our society would be strong, united, and prosperous, right? Okay? So that's a fundamental problem of politics. How do you optimize workforce participation, okay? And traditionally, or historically, there have been three answers. The first is war. The second is religion. And the third is civilization, okay? Now, as you can understand, these three things work because they give structure, meaning, and purpose to our lives, okay? And we have structure, meaning, and purpose. We are much more motivated to work hard. But as you can also see, there are actually lots of problems with all three, right? War is you kill people, that's bad. Religion is superstitious, okay? But civilization itself is also problematic because the logical extreme of civilization is racism, okay? Which is to say that we Russians are better than everyone else, we Chinese are better than everyone else, therefore we can do whatever we want, okay? And this naturally leads to imperialism, right? We have a duty to go conquer other people, to civilize them, right? Something called the white man's burden. And this leads to fascism, okay? Okay? War and conquest are the ultimate good. So historically, war, religion, and civilization have given people structure, meaning, and purpose, but they create a lot of problems. They create suffering and war and pain, okay? So, but over time, what has happened is that all of them, over time, have become much more abstract. And the reason why they've become more abstract is in order to increase the population, in order to create mass society, okay? So let me give you an example of this. The earliest religions in humanity have been polytheistic, okay? And the gods themselves are very much like humans. Think of the Greeks, okay? Zeus, Athena, Hera, okay? It was a polytheistic society, and they were very much like humans. But over time, this polytheism became monotheistic, and it became abstract, okay? The idea of God was so much removed from us. And the benefit of that is that you can have more people believing in one God. And it motivates you to work harder, okay? Because it's such an abstract concept. And because of abstraction, we develop new ideas. For example, money, okay? So rather than have war, religion, and civilization as the structure and center of our society, we want to make money the structure of your society, okay? And this is what we call capitalism. And capitalism, of course, led to the Industrial Revolution, industrialism. Okay? Capitalism meant that societies were becoming wealthier and wealthier, more industrial and more industrialized. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. But there's a problem with capitalism, right? What's a problem with making capital or money at the very heart of your society? Exactly, okay. So the first major problem with capitalism is it's all-consuming. So as Jack says, all capitalism cares about is the expansion and growth of capital, regardless of its effect on society, okay? Profit for the sake of growing profit. It's an all-consuming idea, which can ultimately lead to the destruction of the planet, okay? That's the first problem. What's another problem with capitalism, or the idea of having money as the heart and center of your society? Anyone? Okay. So what this means is that money likes to consolidate itself. Okay, consolidating. Okay, meaning that so the example is, let's just say that each of us had $1 million, right? What's the fastest way for us to grow our money? If we put it together, right? And then we can go invest it. Okay? So in other words, if you just let capitalism do whatever it wants to infinity, what happens is that you exactly have one person with all the money. Okay? Does that make sense? Because that's the fastest way to grow money, by consolidating it. Okay, so that's problematic. What else is wrong with capitalism or money? Okay, so another problem is the idea of alienating or dehumanizing. Okay? What does this mean? Capital alienates and dehumanizes. What does that mean? Exactly, okay. You as a person cease to be human, right? To be a human is to be a complex, multifaceted individual who likes to create and love. But in capitalism, you're only your production value, you're only the amount of money in your bank account, okay? Does that make sense? All right? So for all these reasons, capitalism is really bad. There are actually more reasons, okay? So Karl Marx, in his Communist Manifesto, points out all these problems of capitalism, and he proposes a solution, which is, okay, rather than make money at the heart and center of your industrial society, make the worker the heart and center of your society, okay? So he makes this argument, but what's very revolutionary or prescient about his argument is this is a natural cycle, okay? This is part of the Hegel cycle where capitalism comes along and communism will be the natural evolution of capitalism, okay? Why? Okay, so let's do the thought experiment, okay? Let's do this thought experiment where your parents have died and now you're working in a factory in order to survive. How do you feel about this? Your parents have died, there's no one to support you, so at age 16, 17, 18, you have to go off to a factory to make money for yourself. So how do you feel about this? Are you happy about this? How do you feel?